When retired officer Ethan Walker and his loyal dog Shadow came to claim a forgotten inheritance, all he wanted was peace and a place to heal. But standing beside the lonely mountain cabin was a watchtower, old, scarred, built not for the view, but to guard against something lurking in the darkness. Ethan believed he had found a refuge, but what he truly inherited was not land, but a war left unfinished, a mystery soaked in danger and silence. Support us by subscribing to the channel. The city outside had once been a relentless tide of sirens and car horns, a storm of impatience that wore down Ethan's soul. From his small fourth-floor apartment, the world was just noise and hurry. He stood at the window, a tall, lean man, 40 years old, with short brown hair streaked silver at the temples, his face marked by years of hardship that made him seem older than his time. Yet his eyes still held a gentle kindness. His daily uniform was simple. A faded plaid shirt, navy and gray, always open over a plain gray tee. He had always worn winter like a heavy, reluctant cloak. Its gray streets wound between office buildings and empty lots, the cold seeping into the bones of everything living. Ethan Walker stood at the window of his one-bedroom apartment, hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee, watching as dawn's first dull light spread across the skyline of Billings, Montana. Snow dusted the parked cars below, hiding their dents and rust beneath a soft, forgiving blanket. But no amount of snow could cover the loneliness that had settled in Ethan's heart these last years, after the slow unraveling of his life, the death of his wife, the silence left by grown children, the abrupt end to a 30-year career as a police officer, a profession he'd once believed would grant him a sense of purpose, even into old age. He had let his gray hair grow out, unconcerned with appearances now, but the strong lines of his jaw and the set of his shoulders still spoke of a man used to facing trouble head-on. Ethan was tall, though age and grief had stooped him slightly, and his eyes were the cold blue of Montana winter, flickering with memories both sweet and sorrowful. He moved with the deliberate care of someone who'd learned to hide pain. A slight limp, a faint tremor in his left hand from an old injury, nothing most people would notice. On the battered kitchen table lay a letter that had arrived 2 days before. Heavy, cream-colored paper, official-looking. It was addressed in careful cursive to Mr. Ethan Walker. The return address read only Sterling, Whitmore, and Gold, attorneys at law, Wolf Pine, Montana. When he had opened it, the scent of old ink and legal formality rose to meet him. He read and reread the contents, disbelieving. You have been named as the sole beneficiary in the estate of Arthur Walker. Please attend in person for the transfer of property and effects. The location is provided below. Arthur, Uncle Arthur, his father's older brother, a man Ethan remembered from scattered childhood visits to the far north. A recluse but a legend in family stories, mountain hunter, World War II vet, the sort of man who built cabins by hand and slept with a rifle by the door. Ethan had not seen him in decades. Still, the summons pulled at something deep inside him, a chance to leave behind the stagnant city, if only for a while, and perhaps to reclaim some piece of the wild Montana that had shaped his family. Ethan's most constant companion these days was an old German shepherd named Shadow. Shadow was 10 years old, his coat a tapestry of black and gray, peppered at the muzzle and ears with the silver of age. There was a faint scar on his right hind leg, the legacy of a fight with a barbed wire fence years ago. Shadow's build was large, his presence gentle yet imposing. His amber eyes seemed to see through bluster and bravado, straight to the heart of a person. For all his dignified bearing, Shadow was never far from Ethan's side, following him with the devotion of one who has known loss. The dog's name was not an accident. Shadow had belonged first to Ethan's wife, Anna, a gentle soul whose laughter filled their house before illness took her away. In the worst of her last winter, when she could not sleep, Shadow would curl at her feet, refusing to move, even when the world outside howled with wind. On the night she passed, the dog had lain across the threshold of her bedroom, silent and still, like a sentinel holding back the darkness. Afterward, Ethan could not bear to let him go. He called him Shadow, for the way the dog haunted the silent halls, for the way grief never left one's side. Now, as Ethan packed a few shirts, a battered thermos, and Anna's old photograph into a duffel, Shadow waited by the door, tail thumping softly, as if he knew this journey would matter more than most. The drive north from Billings to Wolf Pine wound through a landscape both familiar and wild. rolling snowfields, frost-bitten fences, lonely stands of pine. The sky threatened snow but delivered only a pale, watery sunlight that did nothing to warm the earth. Ethan's pickup rattled over the rutted highway, Shadow's head resting on his thigh, eyes scanning the roadside as if alert for hidden dangers. After 2 hours, as the fuel gauge dipped toward empty, Ethan pulled into the only gas station in Wolf Pine, a squat, faded building with a single pump and a hand-painted sign that read Miller's. The wind knifed through his coat as he stepped out, and he pulled the collar up around his ears. The girl behind the counter was perhaps 13, small and thin with pale, freckled skin and a tumble of mousy brown hair pulled into a lopsided ponytail. Her name tag read Sarah. She glanced up as Ethan entered, and he saw her mouth move once before she forced out a greeting. "Hi," she stammered, her words caught between shyness and effort. Ethan smiled, trying to put her at ease. "Morning. Fill up? Regular?" Sarah nodded, biting her lip. There was an awkward silence as she rang up the sale, but when Shadow patted inside, she startled slightly, eyes widening. Shadow sat beside Ethan, gazing at the girl with calm curiosity. He's a big dog," she managed, a hint of admiration beneath her nerves. "Yeah, he's all bark, no bite," Ethan replied. He saw Sarah's hands tremble as she handed back the change, and realized the town must be small enough that strangers and strange dogs were rare visitors. As Ethan turned to go, Sarah blurted out, "You're not going up to the old Walker place, are you?" Her voice shrank on the last words. He stopped, surprised. "How'd you know?" Her cheeks flushed pink. "Only people going out that way stop here. My dad says there's something in the woods. At night," she swallowed. "Last week I heard noises, like howling, but not wolves. Some say it's just the wind, or maybe bears. But I saw lights once, moving, like someone sending a signal." Shadow pricked his ears, tilting his head as if he too was listening to old fears. Ethan thanked her and left, his mind turning over her words. He glanced at Anna's photo, tucked into his wallet, her soft smile a comfort in the uncertain morning. Back on the road, the snow began in earnest, swirling around the truck in thick, slow flakes. The climb toward Lincoln Ridge was steep and winding, the forest pressing in close on either side. Pine branches, heavy with snow, bent over the road like archways leading to another world. The silence grew thicker, broken only by the truck's engine and Shadow's soft huffing. The Walker property appeared suddenly around a bend, a long, rutted driveway half buried under drifts, leading to a weather-beaten cabin, and beyond it, the skeletal silhouette of the old fire watchtower standing sentinel above the tree line. The place looked abandoned, save for the blue jays that flitted between the bare branches and the deep, unbroken snow. Ethan stepped out, boots crunching on the ice. Shadow leapt down beside him, nose to the wind, body tense but eager. Ethan paused, taking in the sight. The cabin's sagging porch, the tower rising behind it like a monument to another era. He shivered, not just from the cold, but from the weight of memory, of inheritance, of duty unasked for. He approached the porch, Shadow ranging ahead, sniffing every corner and post. The door creaked open under Ethan's hand, the hinges surprisingly smooth. Inside, the air smelled of old wood and faint tobacco, a hint of Arthur lingering, years after his last departure. Dust motes danced in a shaft of light from the window. Ethan set down his bags, his gaze landing on a faded map of the valley tacked to the wall, pins and red string marking trails he could only guess at. Shadow patrolled the rooms, returning every few moments to press his head against Ethan's thigh, reassuring and watchful. Ethan, heart aching but strangely hopeful, set Anna's photograph on the mantel, a small beacon of warmth in the cold new world. He walked through the empty rooms, listening to the groans and sighs of the old house as the wind picked up outside. From the kitchen window he could see the tower more clearly, tall, wooden, its windows black and blank, as if waiting for someone to climb up and look out over the snowy land. Shadow settled by the fireplace, curling up with a long, satisfied sigh, as if to say, "We are home. We keep watch together, as always." And Ethan, staring into the gathering dusk, felt the beginning of a story won, written not only by men, but by the silent courage of a faithful dog, and the memories of those they loved and lost. The next morning, a brittle cold settled over Lincoln Ridge. Gray light crept through the cracks in the old cabin as Ethan woke to the sound of wind rattling loose boards and Shadow's tail thumping steadily against the wooden floor. The remnants of sleep clung to Ethan, but Shadow was already alert, standing by the door with ears pricked and nose twitching, ready for the unknown rituals of a new home. Ethan brewed strong coffee in a dented percolator, letting the aroma fill the cramped kitchen and take some of the sting out of the morning chill. The first order of business was to make the cabin livable, so he and Shadow set to work, the man moving methodically from room to room, the dog a silent partner, investigating every shadow and scent. The inside was cluttered with Arthur's life, old boots in the entryway, a hunting rifle propped in the corner, yellowed maps and dog-eared paperbacks stacked along the window ledges. It was the dwelling of someone solitary and meticulous, with everything both useful and out of place. While clearing cobwebs from the main hallway, Ethan noticed Shadow circling the heavy oak front door, nose pressed to the floorboards. Shadow pawed insistently at the rug, then looked up, ears flattened in frustration. When Ethan rolled the rug aside, he discovered a metal hatch, expertly set into the floor and nearly invisible beneath layers of dust. It was locked tight, a complex mechanism of interlaced gears and a faded combination dial. Ethan smiled, both exasperated and oddly amused. Uncle Arthur had always been eccentric, but this suggested a level of paranoia far beyond family legend. Nearby, behind a loose panel in the wall, one shadow found by scraping gently with a single claw, Ethan uncovered a shallow recess. Inside sat a small, weathered notebook. Its pages were filled with Arthur's precise, almost architectural handwriting. Lists of dates, hand-drawn diagrams of the cabin, and notations beside the names of familiar and unfamiliar trails. One page detailed the installation of concealed perimeter cameras, each marked by numbers and arrows. As Ethan read, the feeling of being watched, the eerie sense of presence he'd felt since arrival returned, sharper than before. Midday, after clearing a narrow path through the overgrown backyard, Ethan followed Shadow to the base of the Watchtower. The wooden structure loomed overhead, its paint flaking and steps creaking in the cold. Shadow was restless, nose sweeping back and forth over the snow-dusted earth, pausing occasionally to dig at patches of frozen ground. Ethan noticed a tangle of black wire trailing beneath a half-buried rock. Kneeling, he brushed away snow to reveal a tiny weatherproof camera, its lens cracked but still faintly reflecting the pale sun. He traced the cable back toward the cabin, finding more signs of a hidden surveillance system, all cleverly disguised. The realization sent a chill up his spine. Arthur hadn't just hidden from the world. He had been expecting something, or someone. Returning inside, Ethan found the day fading to a pewter gloom. He fed Shadow and ate a can of beans cold, too tired to cook. As dusk thickened, he decided to check the old mailbox perched beside the end of the drive, its green paint peeling and red flag drooping like a tired salute. Shadow accompanied him, darting ahead, then circling back impatiently whenever Ethan lagged. At the mailbox, Shadow grew agitated, barking sharply and pawing at the rusted latch. When Ethan opened it, a stack of old flyers spilled out, along with a single unposted envelope. The paper was thin and cheap, the handwriting urgent and hurried Arthur's, without a doubt. Inside, Ethan found a letter, its message terse and ominous. "If you find this and I am gone, do not trust the silence. The shadows move at night. They are coming." Ethan folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his jacket. He looked down at Shadow, who whined softly and pressed his head against Ethan's leg, as if sensing the gravity of what they'd found. The night closed in early. Ethan set about making the cabin as secure as possible, using some of Arthur's heavy old tools to reinforce the doors and windows. Shadow remained watchful, patrolling the darkened rooms, pausing often by the window that looked out toward the forest. Outside, the trees swayed in the wind, black against the cloudy sky. Later, as Ethan sat by the fireplace, sorting through Arthur's scattered papers, Shadow suddenly perked up, ears rigid, eyes fixed on the far side of the living room. Without warning, he darted to the back door and scratched anxiously at the wood, then turned and barked, a low, commanding sound. Ethan grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, following Shadow's lead. The forest had turned inky and strange under the weight of a moonless night. Ethan followed the beam of his flashlight, the world reduced to shadows and the crunch of snow beneath his boots. Shadow led him to the base of the watchtower, where he sat, unmoving, nose pointed toward the dense line of trees at the edge of the clearing. Then Ethan saw it, a flash of light, brief and deliberate, from deep within the woods. It was not the flicker of lightning or the random reflection of animal eyes. It came again, sharp and rhythmic, long, short, long. Ethan's training prickled at the back of his mind. Morse code. Someone was signaling. Ethan stood frozen, counting the pulses, trying to decipher the message. Shadow pressed against his leg, steady and silent. The signals stopped as suddenly as they began, and silence surged back, heavy as a threat. Heart pounding, Ethan returned to the cabin with Shadow. He checked the locks and double-checked every window. Later, lying awake in the dark, he thought of Arthur's letter, Sarah's frightened warning, and the way the forest seemed to hold its breath at night. He reached into his bag, touching Anna's photograph, drawing strength from her remembered smile. Shadow curled at his feet, a living barrier between Ethan and the unknown. Outside, the woods were restless, and the house seemed smaller against the vast, waiting dark. But Ethan was not alone. With Shadow at his side, he would face whatever the shadows brought, knowing that sometimes the greatest courage lay not in what you could see, but in what you dared to believe. The following day dawned with an eerie stillness, the world outside Ethan's cabin blanketed in a heavy silence. By mid-morning, thick gray clouds had swallowed the sky, and the air held that particular sharpness that foretold a real Montana storm. The temperature dropped fast, and soon the first flakes spiraled down, swirling against the frosted window panes. Ethan watched the gathering snow from the kitchen, feeling an ancient wariness awaken within him. He'd weathered many storms in his life, but isolation always felt deeper when the world was erased by white. Shadow sensed it too, pacing restlessly from door to door, eyes bright and ears taut, the hairs along his back slightly raised. Determined not to let the storm catch them off guard, Ethan spent the morning hauling firewood, checking their stores of canned food, and ensuring the generator would start if the power lines failed. As he worked, the wind began to wail through the pines, sending icy gusts rattling against the walls. Shadow followed him everywhere, weaving between his legs and pausing often to sniff the air, as if reading messages Ethan could not understand. By afternoon, the storm hit in earnest. Sheets of snow blasted the clearing, swirling in frantic eddies. Visibility vanished. The road, the trees, even the path to the watchtower disappeared beneath drifting white. Ethan double-checked every lock and window, drawing the curtains and lighting the battered old oil lamp that once belonged to Arthur. Shadows danced across the log walls, flickering with every shift of the wind. Later, as the storm screamed outside, Ethan huddled by the fireplace, running a hand through Shadow's thick fur. The dog lay at his feet, but every so often would lift his head, listening intently to noises only he could hear. The cabin, for all its age, felt sturdy, a small island of warmth and light in a sea of darkness. Night came quickly in the heart of the blizzard, settling on the cabin like a smothering blanket. Ethan decided to patrol the perimeter, more from habit than necessity, wanting to be sure nothing had shifted in the snow. He pulled on his heavy coat and boots, grabbed his flashlight, and called Shadow, who leaped up at once, tail lashing with energy. Outside, the world had been reduced to shifting white and biting wind. Each step was a struggle through drifts that rose past Ethan's knees. The beam of his flashlight was swallowed by the falling snow, but Shadow led the way, nose to the ground, body low and purposeful. They circled the cabin once, then twice, Ethan checking the windows and doors for ice buildup or signs of damage. On their third circuit, Shadow stopped abruptly by the corner of the porch, ears pricked and body rigid. He began to whine softly, then barked, deep and sharp. Ethan hurried over, shining his flashlight where Shadow was sniffing. There, half buried in the new snow, was a footprint clearly human, but distorted by the wind and cold. Ethan crouched for a better look. The print was larger than his own, and spaced as if the walker had been moving quickly, perhaps even running. A faint trail led away into the whiteout, disappearing after a few steps. Heart pounding, Ethan rose and swept the light around the yard. Another print appeared by the woodpile, then a third by the far corner of the house. Someone had been here, recently enough that the storm had not yet erased the evidence. Shadow growled, hackles bristling. "Easy, boy," Ethan murmured, but his own voice was tense. The realization gnawed at him. Someone, or something, had come to his door in the heart of the storm. They finished their circuit warily, Shadow pausing frequently to sniff and scan the night. Returning inside, Ethan peeled off his snow-caked layers and sat at the table, examining a battered field notebook he'd found in a desk drawer earlier. It was filled with Arthur's careful script. Notes on wildlife, sketches of the land, but also pages of coded numbers and short, fragmented sentences. One line leapt out at Ethan. New tracks near the west fence. Not animal. No prints yesterday today. 5 sets. Another. Heard voices last night. Male, angry, not from town. Will hide supplies in North Shed. As Ethan pondered the journal, Shadow suddenly bounded to the back door, barking again, this time more urgently. Ethan followed, stepping onto the covered porch. The blizzard was so thick he could barely see the edge of the yard. But as he swept his flashlight, he caught a flicker of movement beyond the snow-laden lilacs. For a heartbeat, he glimpsed a figure, a man, stooped and bundled in a heavy parka, watching from the cover of the trees. Ethan's breath caught. The figure vanished almost instantly, but not before the light caught on a pair of wire-rimmed glasses and a shock of unkempt white hair escaping from beneath a knit cap. It was the old man from the outskirts of Wolf Pine. Mr. Taylor Ethan recalled seeing him once at the post office, shuffling along with a bag of groceries, eyes darting suspiciously at everyone who passed. In town, folks whispered that Taylor had been a mining engineer before the accident that left him limping and reclusive. But since losing his wife, he had rarely spoken to anyone. Ethan called out, "Mr. Taylor, is that you?" But the howl of the wind stole the words away. The man had already melted back into the swirling white. Shivering, Ethan stepped back inside, Shadow crowding his heels. The dog was unsettled, pacing between door and window, occasionally glancing at Ethan as if to ask, "What do we do now?" Ethan checked the locks again and drew the curtains tight. Later, as the fire burned low, Ethan continued paging through Arthur's notebooks. At the bottom of an old trunk, Shadow unearthed a metal box, his claws scraping on the wood until Ethan helped pry it out. Inside, carefully wrapped in oilcloth, was a thick, battered field journal with a brass clasp. The first page was dated over a decade earlier, and the entries quickly shifted from accounts of hunting trips to coded observations. Convoy at midnight, no headlights, voices Russian, spoke to deputy, dismissed, must keep watch. Ethan read on, his unease mounting. Arthur had clearly been tracking something or someone around Lincoln Ridge for years. The last entries became almost frantic. "They're getting bolder. Saw them by the water tower. If anything happens to me, tell Ethan." Closing the journal, Ethan stared into the fire. Outside, the storm howled on, but inside, a different kind of tension had taken hold. He placed Anna's photograph on the table beside him and reached down to scratch Shadow behind the ears, drawing comfort from the dog's warmth. Through the window, the snow pressed against the glass, erasing the world beyond. That night, as sleep finally crept over him, Ethan dreamed of footprints winding away into the storm, and of watchful eyes hidden in the trees, shadows that lingered even when the blizzard had passed. Chapter 4. Rescue in the Night. The storm showed no mercy as dusk bled into a night thick with wind and biting snow. Ethan sat near the dying fire, reviewing Arthur's coded journal by lantern light while Shadow lay at his feet, head propped on his paws but ears still sharply attuned to every creak and whistle. Outside, the white world was silent and treacherous, but inside, tension pulsed beneath the thin skin of safety. Ethan's mind circled restlessly around the footprints and the fleeting glimpse of Mr. Taylor. He didn't believe in ghosts, but sometimes, out here in the wild, the line between the living and the vanished blurred. Just past midnight, a sharp, frantic bark jolted Ethan from his uneasy half-sleep. Shadow was already at the door, hackles raised, his body quivering with urgency. Ethan moved quickly, pulling on his boots and coat, pocketing a flashlight, his old service revolver, and a battered walkie-talkie relics of a life that sometimes felt like someone else's. He stepped onto the porch and was instantly assaulted by the icy wind, snowflakes swirling in mad dance around him. Shadow darted ahead, his black and gray shape almost melting into the night. They moved along the porch, the light barely cutting the blizzard's thick veil. It was then Ethan heard it, a muffled shout, the scrape of boots, and the distinctive slam of a van door somewhere beyond the barn. He cut the beam, ducking low. Shadow crept ahead, nose to the ground, body taut as a drawn wire. From the darkness, voices floated rough, urgent, not local. Ethan inched closer, moving with the careful patience of old training. Beyond the barn, headlights flickered behind a screen of wind-blown snow. He saw the outlines of 3 men, all dressed in bulky winter gear. They were struggling to carry someone smaller, limp, the shape barely resisting. As they drew nearer to the van, a 4th figure appeared. A woman, face pale under a shock of dark hair, blood on her temple, handcuffed and half-conscious, her uniform beneath a torn parka revealed her as a police officer, the name tag reading R. Evans. She was young, perhaps 28, slight and athletic, with a stubborn tilt to her jaw even now. Blood matted her hair and her breaths came in jagged gasps. One man barked an order in a low voice, gruff and thick with an accent Ethan recognized from past arrests. East Coast, maybe Russian roots. Another, taller, with a jagged scar on his cheek, kept looking over his shoulder, scanning the shadows. Something about the way he moved triggered a memory in Ethan years ago. The same posture, the same angry scowl in a mugshot. The man's name had been Vlad Markov, and Ethan had arrested him during a drug bust in Billings almost a decade earlier. Markov had sworn vengeance, but Ethan had never seen him again until now. Crouched behind a stack of firewood, Ethan listened as the men argued. "We should leave her. Cops always bring trouble," one spat. Vlad's answer was ice cold. "Orders." "She comes. That's it." The van's side door slid open, revealing crates and bundles stacked high, the bitter smell of gasoline and something chemical tainting the air. Ethan scanned the area, searching for any advantage. Shadow pressed against his knee, eyes fixed on the men, waiting for the word. In that moment, a plan formed. Risky, but possible if timing was perfect. The wind howled, and for a heartbeat, the men's attention was elsewhere. Ethan hissed, "Go!" Shadow lunged forward with a fierce, sudden bark, bounding into the circle of headlights. Chaos erupted. The men shouted. 2 drew pistols, but Shadow, agile and unafraid, darted between them, jaws snapping at a gloved hand and sending a box clattering to the snow. Ethan used the distraction, circling wide. He reached Rachel Evans as she slumped against the van, her eyes glazed but flickering with determination. "I'm here to help," Ethan whispered. She blinked, tried to nod. Quickly he used his knife to cut the plastic tie binding her ankles, then hoisted her over his shoulder, ignoring her weak protest. Shadow was still weaving and snarling, keeping the men's attention. "Shoot the dog!" Vlad snarled. But the storm and confusion made aim impossible. Ethan ducked behind the barn, keeping low, Shadow at his side, guiding his escape with sharp barks. Rachel clung to Ethan, her face twisted with pain, but she did not slow him down. They scrambled over a fence, Ethan nearly slipping on the icy rail, but Shadow steadied him with a nudge. Bullets cracked through the night, but the storm swallowed the noise and the trajectory alike. Ethan veered toward the trees, desperate for cover. Shadow darted ahead, pausing at a fallen log. "Down!" Ethan hissed. He pressed Rachel to the ground and shielded her with his own body, breath clouding in the freezing air. The gang pursued, but they were clumsy in the dark, unused to the land. After several tense minutes, their shouts faded, replaced by frustrated curses and the distant rev of the van's engine. Ethan waited, heart pounding, counting the seconds until silence returned. Shadow stood watch, muscles rigid. Finally, Ethan lifted Rachel, supporting her as they picked their way back toward the cabin, circling wide to avoid any returning threats. Inside, Ethan laid Rachel on the sofa, wrapping her in blankets and checking her injuries. Shadow watched intently, nose twitching, as if he too was searching for wounds only a dog could sense. Rachel's eyelids fluttered. "Who are you?" she whispered. "Ethan Walker. I live here. You're safe for now," he replied, voice gentle but firm. She closed her eyes, relief and exhaustion mingling in her features. As he cleaned the blood from her forehead, Ethan glanced at Shadow, who stood at the door, eyes fixed on the darkness. "Good boy," Ethan murmured, gratitude swelling in his chest. Without Shadow's courage and instincts, they never would have pulled this off. In the flicker of the firelight, Rachel stirred, looking at Shadow and managing a faint smile. "Your dog, he saved me." Ethan nodded. "He's got a habit of that." Later, as Rachel slept fitfully and Ethan dozed by her side, Shadow prowled from window to window, guarding against any threat. The night outside was still wild, but inside the cabin, hope had found a foothold. Unbeknownst to Ethan, Vlad Markov watched from the shadows near the tree line, jaw clenched in cold rage. He had recognized Ethan's face in the moment of chaos, but had hidden his own, choosing vengeance with patience. The score between them, unsettled, was only just beginning. The morning after the rescue brought no calm, only a tense hush settling over the cabin as the blizzard relented to a silent, pewter sky. Snow hung in thick mounds on the eaves and windowsills, muffling the world outside. Ethan kept the fire roaring, nervous energy making his movements brisk as he checked each window for signs of tracks, hands lingering longer on the grip of his revolver. Shadow, his coat flecked with ash and the telltale white of age, stalked from room to room, ever alert, tail stiff, nose quivering at the faintest sound. Rachel Evans, swaddled in Ethan's heaviest flannel shirt and a woolen blanket, stirred groggily on the couch. Even injured, she radiated the quiet authority of someone trained to keep her head in a crisis. Her face was thin, still etched with pain from the gash on her temple, but her brown eyes were sharp and restless. There was a hollowness about her, a weight she could not quite conceal, as if her courage was something forged by necessity rather than nature. She tried to sit up but winced, clutching her ribs. Ethan knelt beside her, offering a steaming mug of coffee. "Easy. You're safe for now," Rachel forced a grateful smile, voice hoarse but determined. "Thank you. I should have done better. Shouldn't have gotten caught out there." She looked away, the shame of failure clear on her face. "That gang. I thought I'd found them in Helena last month. They slipped away, and my partner, he was transferred. I told the department I could do it alone. I was wrong." Ethan listened quietly, recognizing the self-recrimination, the old echo of his own regrets. "You're not alone here." "Not anymore." Shadow nudged Rachel's hand gently with his nose, as if seconding the promise. The morning passed in anxious waiting. They rationed food, took turns napping, and listened for the sound of engines or footsteps in the snow. Ethan reviewed the notes he'd copied from Arthur's journal, wondering if the cryptic codes and marked maps might help them predict another attack. He had once trusted the law to keep him safe. Now, in this isolated place, he trusted only his instincts and Shadow. By late afternoon, the sense of siege became real. Shadow stiffened at the window, ears canted forward, then erupted into frantic barking. Ethan caught the glint of movement through the trees, a dark SUV, snow-chained tires crunching over ice, halting at the edge of the clearing. 4 men emerged, moving with predatory caution, each one bundled in heavy coats, faces shadowed by knit caps and scarves. One, a thick-set man with a bristling beard and icy blue eyes, cradled a shotgun. Another, slighter, moved with a nervous, twitchy energy, fingers constantly fiddling with a pocket knife. The third was bald and heavy-jawed, while the last hung back, watching with a practiced wariness that marked him as their leader, Vlad Markov. Rachel's eyes widened. She drew in a breath, knuckles white on the mug. "That's them." "That's the leader, Vlad. He's smarter than the rest. He doesn't leave loose ends." Ethan glanced at her, mind racing. "Are you up for a fight if it comes to it?" She nodded, jaw set. "I can shoot." They quickly checked their supplies, a single rifle, Ethan's revolver, and a few rounds of ammunition. Rachel insisted on taking the rifle, propping herself up by the window while Ethan prepared to defend the door. Shadow crouched low beside Ethan, body quivering with anticipation, every muscle ready for action. The first assault was sudden, a brick through the side window, followed by a shouted demand. "Give us the girl, old man! Walk out now and you keep your dog!" Ethan ignored them, heart pounding, blood thundering in his ears. Rachel squeezed off a warning shot, the crack echoing through the clearing. The gang retreated briefly, regrouping. Moments later, the leader barked an order in Russian, and 2 of the thugs darted around the side of the cabin trying to flank them. Shadow growled deep in his throat. When one man, a tall, wiry figure, forced the back door, Shadow launched himself in a blur of teeth and fur. The thug yelped, slashing wildly with a crowbar, but Shadow clamped down on his arm, wrenching him to the ground. As Ethan covered Rachel, Shadow tore at the man's coat, yanking loose a folded slip of paper from the inside pocket. The man kicked, landing a glancing blow to Shadow's side, but the dog held on until Ethan's warning shout sent the assailant staggering back into the snow. Bleeding, clutching his arm, the thug retreated, limping into the cover of the trees with the others. Ethan slammed the door, bolting it, and hurried to Shadow's side. The dog limped but wagged his tail, eyes bright. Ethan took the crumpled paper, opening it with trembling fingers. Scrawled in hurried block letters were a string of numbers and letters, what looked like a phone number, and a series of codes, along with a street address in Billings. Rachel studied it, recognition dawning. That's a drop location. I've seen these numbers in their files before coded dates for shipments. This could blow the case wide open. For the next hour, tension ebbed and flowed. The attackers circled the house, hurling threats and rocks, but never risked another close assault. At one point, Ethan glimpsed Vlad Markov watching from the trees, eyes hard and calculating. As darkness crept in, Rachel's hands shook, her face tight with a memory she could not escape. In Helena, I thought I had Vlad. I waited for backup, but I got scared and I hesitated. He escaped. My partner said it wasn't my fault, but the chief, well, he made sure I remembered my mistake. Her voice faltered. I can't let them win again. Ethan placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Everyone falters. What matters is what you do next, Shadow. Sensing the heaviness in the room, settled at Rachel's feet, resting his chin on her boot in silent support. They took turns keeping watch, the long night broken only by distant engine sounds and the sigh of wind in the chimney. Ethan thought of Anna, of Arthur, of all the people he'd failed and saved in a lifetime on the force. Shadow dozed by the fire, twitching in his sleep, always ready for the next call to action. Near midnight, the cabin fell quiet. The snow outside sparkled under a cloud break, the world momentarily serene. But inside, Ethan, Rachel, and Shadow braced for what would come next, bolstered by hard-won hope and the fragile promise of the clue clenched in Ethan's hand. Night receded, leaving behind a pale, bruised dawn. The storm had lifted, and the snow outside the cabin glittered in long blue shadows. Inside, the air was heavy with exhaustion, but something had shifted. The sense of siege was still there, yet it was joined by a sliver of purpose. Rachel, her features drawn but eyes sharper, sat hunched over Arthur's battered field journal at the kitchen table, tracing the lines of his coded notations with a steady finger. Ethan hovered nearby, the paper Shadow had seized from their attacker resting on the counter between them, its cryptic numbers already burned into memory. Shadow lay beside the table, head on his paws, but every now and then his tail thumped gently against the leg of Rachel's chair, grounding the anxious energy in the room. A shaft of sunlight illuminated Arthur's journal, the edges curled and stained. Ethan set a cup of coffee before Rachel, his own hands trembling only a little as he sat. Arthur must have known something big was coming, he said quietly. These notes, they aren't just ramblings. Look. He turned to a page dated nearly a year ago, sketches of the forest trails around Lincoln Ridge, columns of numbers and letters, and circled in red, a phone number that matched the code on the slip of paper Shadow had wrested from their assailant. There were references to cargo drops, false shipments, and rendezvous points marked only by initials. Rachel's years on the force had trained her to spot patterns. She picked up the thread with growing excitement, connecting Arthur's cryptic observations to real-world cases. This is more than surveillance, she murmured. He was working with someone on the inside. These codes are similar to FBI protocols. I think Arthur was a confidential informant, or at least someone they trusted. Ethan's gaze fell to the battered radio on the kitchen shelf, then to the heavy brass key he'd found hidden behind a loose stone in the fireplace earlier that morning. The key was engraved with a sequence of numbers, coordinates perhaps, or another code. He left us a trail, Ethan said. If we can find out who he was working with, maybe we can get help. I don't think we're alone in this. Rachel's Shadow lifted his head, eyes bright and alert. It was almost as if he understood the gravity of their work, a dog always listening, always ready. Ethan scratched his ear, drawing comfort from the familiar warmth. As they pored over the documents, a sudden knock rattled the back door. Ethan stiffened, hand going instinctively to his revolver. But Shadow, instead of growling, wagged his tail and moved to the door with a curious whine. Ethan opened the door cautiously, and the cold rushed in, followed by a tall, wiry old man bundled in a threadbare navy parka, gray hair wild and wind-tossed. Mr. Taylor, Ethan's enigmatic neighbor, stood in the threshold, blinking through fogged glasses. His lined face was creased with equal parts suspicion and concern. Taylor was a relic of the mountains, once a mining engineer, now something of a ghost himself, known in Wolfpine for his eccentric ways and solitude. He walked with a slight limp, the result of a long-ago cave-in, but there was a wiry strength in his posture and a keenness in his gaze that belied his years. "Saw the lights last night," he said gruffly, voice like gravel. "Heard the shots, too." "Figured you could use another set of eyes." Rachel eyed him warily, but Ethan gestured him in, motioning for Taylor to sit at the table. The old man's boots left melting prints on the floor. He glanced at Shadow, who sniffed him thoroughly and then settled back, satisfied. Taylor fished a battered envelope from inside his coat. "Arthur trusted you, Ethan. Trusted me too, in his way. We weren't close, but when he got nervous a few years back, he asked me to pass messages to a man in Billings. Tall, suit, FBI-type name was Collins. Said if anything ever happened to him, someone should check the old tower." Rachel's eyes widened. "You were Arthur's go-between?" Taylor shrugged. "Didn't know the details, just knew enough to stay out of trouble. But after last night, well, I couldn't sleep, not knowing you were out here alone." Ethan and Rachel exchanged glances. Taylor's confession made the coded clues fall into place. "The key," Ethan said, pulling the brass key from his pocket. "Maybe it opened something in the tower." Together, they crossed the snowy yard to the base of the Watchtower. The morning sun made diamonds of the drifts, but inside the tower it was cold and dark. Ethan found the hidden panel beneath the stairs, just as Arthur's notes described. The key fit perfectly. Inside was a dusty steel box, locked but not impenetrable. Rachel jimmied it open with her pocket knife. Inside, a shortwave radio, a set of frequency lists, a stack of documents stamped confidential, and a sealed envelope marked for EW only. Ethan opened the envelope. Arthur's writing filled the single page. "If you're reading this, I'm gone. The men you saw last night, they're not just smugglers, they're part of something bigger. I tried to warn the Bureau. The numbers are codes for shipments, guns, drugs, even people. Use the radio channel 14. Collins will answer. Trust Taylor. Trust the dog. They'll get you through." Rachel immediately tuned the shortwave to channel 14, hands shaking. The static crackled and hissed. Then, after several tense moments, a voice replied, "This is Collins." "Who is this?" Rachel identified herself, giving her badge number, and Ethan quickly summarized their situation, mentioning Arthur, the codes, and the recent attack. The agent on the other end responded with cautious urgency. "Stay put. Help is coming. Whatever you do, don't let them near the tower. We've been tracking this ring for months. You're not alone." Relief warred with exhaustion. Taylor, awkward but determined, offered to keep watch from his own property, promising to alert them if he saw any more movement in the woods. Rachel squeezed Ethan's hand, the old fear in her eyes replaced by resolve. "We're going to finish what Arthur started," she said. That night, as they sat around the fire, the weight of the past days began to lift. Ethan stared at the envelope from Arthur, the dog's head resting in his lap, and thought of all the ways a legacy could be measured, not in property, but in the lives touched, the courage kindled, the truths uncovered. Outside, the wind had calmed, but inside, their purpose burned brighter than ever. Evening returned with an unnatural hush, the air brittle as glass, and every tree heavy with snow that now glowed ghostly in the blue twilight. The radio call with Agent Collins had brought a surge of hope, but both Ethan and Rachel knew the night ahead would test every ounce of their endurance. The wind outside sharpened, carrying with it the bitter tang of smoke and omen of what was to come. Inside the cabin, Ethan checked the bolts and barricaded doors, his movements methodical but quick. Rachel, pale but composed, loaded the rifle and placed spare shells in her jacket pocket, her wounded side bandaged tightly beneath borrowed clothes. She looked smaller now in Ethan's old parka, but there was a fire in her brown eyes, kindled by days of fear and humiliation, now finally burning toward defiance. Shadow was restless, pacing from door to window, nose quivering at every scent the wind brought in. His coat was patchy with dried blood from the previous scuffle, but he showed no sign of slowing. Sometimes he paused at Rachel's feet, pressing his large head against her knee for reassurance. His loyalty now split evenly between Ethan and the woman he'd helped save. Ethan noticed this and felt an unexpected warmth beneath the anxiety. It was the smallest things that made men, women, and dogs into a family, even if only for a night. As dusk deepened, Taylor slipped out the back door. He moved quietly for a man in his late 60s, his thin frame hunched against the cold, a battered trapper's cap pulled low over wild white hair. He carried a battered canvas satchel filled with rusted but ingenious makeshift traps, tripwires made from old fishing line, empty tin cans to rattle, and a small flare gun. Taylor spoke little, but before he left, he pressed a weathered hand to Ethan's shoulder and nodded once, his sharp blue eyes full of meaning. "If they come from the west, I'll give you warning. Keep the radio close." Then he vanished into the swirling snow, Shadow, and legend, both. The first sign of the assault was the flicker of fire through the forest, the unmistakable arc of a Molotov cocktail, lobbed clumsily at the outbuilding beside the cabin. The shed burst into flame, its dry timbers blazing hot and fast, sending billowing smoke across the yard. Shadow barked furiously, hackles raised. Ethan grabbed a fire extinguisher and hurried to douse the worst of the flames, Rachel covering him from the porch, her aim steady despite trembling hands. Gunshots crackled, the bullets whistling into the snow-packed walls. Ethan ducked low, heart racing, but adrenaline made his focus razor-sharp. He returned fire, squeezing off measured shots and forcing the attackers to scatter. The siege was on. The gang circled the cabin, 3 men on foot, each carrying a weapon, one with a pump-action shotgun, another with a battered AK-47, and the third with a pistol, his face hidden by a balaclava. Vlad Markov, their leader, hung back near the tree line, shouting orders in Russian and English, his voice both furious and strangely calm. His heavy-set build and jagged scar stood out even in the shadows, a silhouette of brute strength and old vendettas. The attackers pushed closer. One tried the back door but tripped Taylor's homemade trap, a string of cans clattering loudly, followed by a flare that lit the yard in garish red. The startled thug fired blindly, his shots missing entirely, and Shadow leapt through the broken window in a blur of fur and muscle. He hit the gunman in the leg, teeth finding purchase in the thick canvas of the man's pants. The man screamed, flailing, and managed to club Shadow across the flank with his rifle. The dog let go and limped away, yelping, but the damage was done. The attacker's advance was broken. Rachel dropped to one knee at the shattered window and fired, sending a spray of glass and snow into the darkness. She clipped one attacker in the shoulder. He fell, cursing in a guttural voice, while his companion dragged him back toward the trees. Ethan, breathing hard, ushered Shadow back inside, his hand coming away sticky with the dog's blood. Shadow whined, but wagged his tail, licking Ethan's cheek with an unshakable devotion. Rachel knelt and checked his wound, a gash along his rib cage, not deep, but painful. She stroked his head, voice shaky but fond. "You're braver than any cop I've known, buddy." For nearly an hour, the standoff continued. Taylor, somewhere in the darkness, set off another trap, a flare high in the trees, drawing gunfire away from the cabin. The radio crackled with short, coded bursts from Collins, the promise of help growing closer. Rachel and Ethan alternated between windows, covering every angle, sharing whispered words of encouragement and quiet moments of grim humor. "Remind me to write up this place as a safety hazard," Ethan muttered at one point, and Rachel actually laughed, the sound thin but real. Outside, the storm began to return, gusts of wind driving the snow sideways, muffling all but the sharpest sounds. The gang regrouped, making one last push. Vlad Markov led the charge, shouting orders, gun blazing. Bullets tore through the cabin walls, splinters flying. Ethan ducked, feeling a hot sting on his arm as a stray round grazed him. Rachel fired back, catching another assailant in the thigh. In the confusion, Taylor set off his last trap, an old car battery wired to a length of chicken wire. When a thug tried to scale the porch, the wire sparked and sizzled, sending the man tumbling backward, howling in pain. It was enough to make the gang hesitate, just as distant sirens rose above the wind. Colin's voice came sharp and clear over the radio. "We have you in sight. Hold your position." Floodlights cut through the trees, painting the snowy clearing in a stark, hopeful white. The gang, seeing their window close, broke and ran, stumbling into the woods. Vlad Markov vanished among the shadows, his threat not gone, only postponed. Ethan slumped against the wall, breath coming in ragged gasps. Rachel slumped beside him, still clutching the rifle, her face streaked with sweat and relief. Shadow limped over, pushing his big head into Ethan's hand and then Rachel's, tail wagging slow and strong. The three of them huddled together, survivors in the truest sense, each battered but unbroken. Taylor returned at last, a small cut bleeding on his temple but his eyes shining with fierce pride. He stood in the doorway, nodded once, and gave a thin, crooked smile. "Hell of a night, folks. Glad I didn't sleep through it." Day broke pale and clear, the aftermath of the siege scattered across the snowy yard footprints, burned timbers, the eerie silence that always followed violence. Ethan, exhausted but upright, leaned against the cabin's battered doorframe. His face was drawn and grizzled, the stubble of a sleepless night etched deeper into his weathered features. Rachel slept on the sofa inside, finally free from fear, her arm bandaged, her breathing calm and regular. Shadow, bandaged but wagging his tail, limped from window to window as if he had appointed himself guardian of every last corner. Just after dawn, the sound of rotors thudded through the mountain air. Ethan stepped onto the porch, shielding his eyes as a black and white helicopter circled, emblazoned with the insignia of the U.S. Forest Service and the Department of Justice. It landed in a swirl of snow at the edge of the clearing, and two teams deployed federal agents in tactical vests and local rangers in green and khaki, led by a tall, sunburned man with a gentle southern accent who introduced himself as Ranger Marshall. Marshall was lean, his hair cut short, and his brown eyes took in every detail with the kind of patient attentiveness honed over decades of backcountry service. He moved quietly, but spoke with confidence and a humor that softened the edge of an intense morning. "Mr. Walker," he said, shaking Ethan's hand, firm and respectful. "You did good work. Looks like you saved more than just yourself up here." Behind him, Agent Collins, mid-40s, dark hair slicked back, sharp suit under a heavy parka, nodded and thanked Ethan and Rachel for their bravery. Collins radiated a city energy, every gesture controlled and brisk, but he stopped to kneel beside Shadow and scratch his ear with real affection. Within minutes, the remaining gang members were found and cuffed, Vlad Markov among them. The man's cold stare lingered on Ethan, but his bravado was broken. Collins assured Ethan, "He's going away for a long time. You did what even a task force couldn't." Inside the cabin, Rachel finally stirred, squinting against the sunlight slanting through the window. A female paramedic named Jasmine, African-American, round-faced and quick to laughter, checked her wounds and pronounced her lucky, then quietly praised Ethan's field dressing. Rachel looked to Ethan, a silent thanks in her gaze, then asked Collins, "Can I be transferred to Wolf Pine, sir? There's a lot of work to do out here. People need protection. And honestly, I'd like to stay close to the people who kept me alive." Collins smiled, nodding. "I think we can make that happen." Taylor arrived late in the morning, his limp a little more pronounced, but his face wreathed in a rare, boyish grin. Word had spread, and townsfolk soon appeared at the edge of the property. Sarah's father, the storekeeper, brought coffee and pastries. A couple of local teens waved at Ethan and Shadow. Sarah herself, small, skinny, pale as winter, but eyes bright with relief, handed Ethan a carefully folded envelope. Her handwriting was childish but determined. "Thank you for being brave and for helping the people of Wolf Pine." The shadows are gone now. Sarah Ethan's hands shook as he read it, the words doing more to heal old wounds than any victory ever could. By midday, the yard bustled with rangers and agents. Taylor found himself the center of attention, recounting stories of Arthur and the early days of the Watchtower. Where once he'd been the town eccentric, today he was treated as a respected elder, asked for advice, greeted with smiles. He bore it with modesty, his voice quieter as the attention grew, but he kept a watchful eye on Ethan, as if reluctant to let go of this new, hard-won camaraderie. When the last agents prepared to leave, Collins pulled Ethan aside. "We'd like you to stay on, Mr. Walker. The Watchtower needs a caretaker, and after what you've done, you're the right man for the job. Think of it as a chance to protect this land and maybe start something new." Ethan hesitated. The city's noise and sorrow felt 1,000 miles away. He looked at Rachel, who was laughing with Jasmine outside the cabin, at Taylor, surrounded by neighbors, at Shadow, who was curled in the sun, finally resting. The silence here was no longer empty, but full of meaning, a promise. He nodded, feeling something inside him loosen, something he hadn't dared hope for since Anna's passing. "I'd be honored," he said, voice rough. In the days that followed, Wolf Pine rallied. Rachel joined the sheriff's department, working cases that brought her closer to the town and to Ethan. Taylor visited often, sometimes with coffee, sometimes with stories about Arthur and the ridgeline. Sarah stopped by with her father, bringing notes, cookies, and once even a sketch of Shadow, her shyness fading little by little with each visit. As winter melted into spring, the land around Lincoln Ridge began to thaw. The Watchtower, battered but unbroken, stood sentinel over a valley that now felt like home. Ethan tended the grounds, kept the radios tuned, and found comfort in the daily rituals of quiet service. Shadow grew older, his limp a little worse, but his spirit undiminished. At night, As Ethan sat by the fire with Rachel and Taylor sharing stories, laughter, and silence, he realized that Arthur's greatest gift wasn't land or even the secrets unearthed here, but the bonds forged in adversity. Sometimes, when dusk fell and the wind picked up, Ethan walked to the tower, Anna's photo in his pocket, and looked out over the valley. The world was still dangerous, but it was also beautiful and worth defending. As he stood there, shadow pressed close, tail thumping, and for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt whole, a guardian not only of land, but of hope, memory, and the kind of courage that never truly dies. In the stillness after every storm, we are reminded that miracles aren't always thunder and lightning. Sometimes they are found in the quiet bravery of a wounded dog, the gentle kindness of a neighbor, the second chance given to a weary soul, or the courage to stand up for others even when no one is watching. Perhaps these moments are the true miracles God sends to remind us that we are never alone, no matter how fierce the darkness. In our everyday lives, we often search for grand signs or answers, but it is through small acts of love, forgiveness, and perseverance that we find hope and sometimes even redemption. When communities come together, when strangers become family, and when we choose to protect, to heal, and to forgive, we become part of something much greater than ourselves. So if this story touched your heart or reminded you of your own miracles, I invite you to share this video with someone who needs a sign of hope. Drop a comment below and let us know your thoughts, or tell us about a time you witnessed a small miracle. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that restore faith in kindness and courage. If you believe in miracles and wish for God's blessings on everyone watching, write Amen in the comments. May God bless you and your loved ones now and always.